Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. I'm on Shane Walk in Chelsea, London, and behind me you can see that blue plaque where Sylvia Pankhurst lived much of her adult life. So she was a member of that very distinguished family who probably did more than any other to bring about the female franchise. So she's born in Manchester. Her father, Richard, was a prominent barrister, and he believed that women ought to have the right to vote. Her mother Emmeline, was heavily involved in it too. She had another sister, Christabel, who was a stalwart of the movement. She had a brother as well who wasn't involved in the movement. There was another sister who moved to Australia who was tangentially involved. I can forget her name actually. So the Pankhursts moved down to London towards the turn of the century. By this time Richard Pankhurst had died. He'd involved in the Liberal Party. And so John Stuart Mill had argued in the House of Commons that women ought to be permitted to vote, and he was the second ever person to do so. I don't recall the first, but possibly it was Jeremy Bentham. And in those days this was thought to be sheer lunacy. But of course, if you look back to the Middle Ages, there had been women in Parliament, and indeed it's the reason in the 16th century women had been permitted to vote, because in the House of Lords this was representing the Lords spiritual, as in bishops, archbishops, but also abbots in the Middle Ages, and therefore abbesses. An abbess, a senior nun, in charge of an abbey which have a lot of farmland to provide an income for the nuns and food. Is this house we're looking at? Yeah, above my thumb where the blue plaque is. So it was representing land, not people. So some women had been in Parliament, very, very few, but it proved the point. And the right to vote was linked to owning real property, as in houses, farmland, and so forth. The medieval legislation would say the best men shall choose from amongst themselves 2 burghers, not the one you eat, as in town councillors, from each borough, and 2 knights from each shire, as in county. So, but men in Latin, the legislation was all in Latin to the 17th century, could be interpreted to mean people of either gender or males only. But the Representation of the People Act had actually tightened it up and said that the right to vote was restricted solely to male persons. Nevertheless, they could prove the point that women had previously cast the vote, and this was no novelty. In fact, it was restricting the right to vote to only the male sex was the innovation, and the constitutional vandalism, no doubt. So that's what they said. But okay, the statute had specifically ruled out women voting, and there had been a court case about this in Manchester. Richard Pankhurst was involved, but the judge ruled that even if a woman fulfilled all the other criteria for holding the franchise, she was personally incapable of exercising the right to cast a ballot. But legislation changed in the late 19th century, granting women the right to vote in local elections for their town council or county council, to even stand for election, be elected a councillor, would have said an alderman back then. Even as a woman, they tend to say alderman, not alderwoman, and indeed be mayor of her borough, and a few of them were. And 1850s, women started to go to university, Bedford College, London. 1874, Oxford University admitted women, and Cambridge University about the same time. And on. And the Married Women's Property Act, so things were changing. Women were publishing novels. And other countries allowed the women the right to vote. New Zealand, various states in the United States. New Jersey had it briefly after the Revolution and changed it, got rid of it. France had it briefly in the 1790s and said it was a mistake. Even here, some women had asked a parliament under Cromwell for the right to vote, and they were told to go and meddle with their housewifery. They shouldn't concern themselves with male affairs. Anyway, so Sylvia Pankhurst, she was a brainy and a vivacious sort, and a notable public speaker. Joined the Women's Social and Political Union, which was run by her mother, but some people felt that she was a dictatrix of this, and we shouldn't swap the subjection of man to woman for the subjection of woman to woman. But it was a small, disciplined group of highly dedicated activists. They began hitting men where it hurt in the sports by vandalising golf clubs, or pouring weed killer on golf greens and things like that, burning down sports pavilions, setting off bombs which didn't harm anyone, chaining themselves to railings, going to prison. She was in prison a few times. The Cat and Mouse Act, properly called the Prisoners Discharge of Ill Health Act, where they went on hunger strike, trying to force feed them without killing them. The wardresses, as in the female prison officers, holding the prisoner down, whilst the physician, invariably male, feeding her so she couldn't kill herself through starvation. later used against Irish Republicans, but none of these women successfully starved themselves to death. Let out temporarily, start eating, then rearrested, put her back in. Cat and mouse. Of course, when you let her out, she might go into hiding, you might never catch her again. Spending some time in France to escape prosecution. And often when they were arrested, refusing to pay fines or be bound over to keep the peace, forced the authorities to send themselves to prison, thinking it would generate more sympathy. But fairly successful, heckling and harassing anti-suffragist politicians such as Winston Churchill and David Lloyd George of the Liberal Party. Somewhat sympathetic to the Labour Party, but didn't want to join any party, alienate any party, have as broad a coalition of support as possible. Conservatives too, some Conservatives were on their side. And there was the Women's League for Opposing Female Suffrage, led by Mrs. Humphrey. Anyhow, fast forward, they gained their objectives. They achieved their objectives towards the end of the First World War. April 1918, the Representation of the People Act, which changed various things, that virtually all men were permitted to vote, so long as they'd been in that constituency for at least 6 months. Soldiers and sailors on service were allowed to vote at the age of 19, not 21. So women were allowed to vote at the age of 30. Unless, of course, they were below 30 and over 21, but either on the local government register or married to a man who was on the local government register, because we don't want flappers voting, as in those who are not serious enough. Women mature slower than men, that was the idea. But it was they'd almost achieved equality, and 10 years later they actually achieved equality when it was amended. So that was her. So she was, in the 1920s, she moved into left-wing radicalism. S for socialist, that's how easy to remember them. Thank you so much, Emmeline, for naming your daughters this way. Christabel, C, was conservative. Sylvia, S, was socialist. So she's in the Labour Party, but she moved to the left of the Labour Party, became a communist, and really rejected everything conventional. She lived with her Italian boyfriend openly. Living in sin was described to be utterly disgraceful back then. She became pregnant. Her mother said, well, you simply must get married right now to prevent a scandal. She said, no, I'm going to give birth to him. I disbelieve in marriage. That is about the subjection of women, and it's just a bourgeois convention. It's oppressive. No need. And she rejected Christianity. So she gave birth out of wedlock, and her mother felt this was such a disgrace to the family. Her mother cut off all contact. They never spoke again. Her mother died soon afterwards. Her mother got involved in some unusual Christian sect. I can't remember whether they were like Seventh-day Adventists or whatever. She was one for a bit of a lunatic fringe cause. Went to the United States evangelizing, died in the 1920s. And her other sister, Christabel, was involved in the Conservative Party. Her mother had stood for a parliament as a Conservative, not been elected. And that was that. So she lived on to 1960, was not very well known towards the end of her life. Campaigned for racial equality, against the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, and so forth. Her paramour was an Italian anti-fascist. So that is a little bit about Sylvia Pankhurst, who lived there. Toodaloo.